Hello everybody, welcome to this program. Today we shall talk about how to write a research proposal in philosophy. All of us know that when one applies for a PhD program in Indian universities, one is required to attach a research proposal along with the application. The research proposal is important for two reasons. One, the person who is writing the research proposal requires to do a fair amount of research so that the main theme of the research gets clear to the researcher, and the researcher also grows a fair amount of idea about how to get along in his or her research work. The research proposal is also important because the research proposal gives an idea to the reader as to what is the main focus of the research and how the researcher wants to proceed in his or her research pursuit. The first thing that we should remember while writing a research proposal is to select a suitable title of the research. Ideally, the title should give the reader an idea about the main focus or about the main theme of the research. The title should be precise. It should not be too long or cumbersome. Also, it should not be formulated in an interrogative manner. So the title should be declarative in the sense that the title itself should give the reader an idea what the researcher wants to do in his or her research work. The next point that one should remember is an introduction to the research. Once the main theme of the research has been selected, any theme in philosophy makes sense only in the context of a larger philosophical problem or question. So in the second part, which is called introduction, the researcher should very briefly present the larger philosophical scenario against which the researcher wants to focus on a specific theme. For example, if the researcher wants to do his or her research, say on the problem of universals, the problem of universal, the question regarding universal has been introduced since Greek thought. And later on, philosophers down the ages have taken up this issue from different perspectives and have presented their views on this problem of universal. So if one wants to do research on universal, one is required to set the background against which the researcher would like to focus on a specific aspect of the problem of universal. So basically, introduction consists of presenting the larger philosophical issue against which the researcher would like to focus on a specific question from a specific perspective. The third part of the research proposal would consist of the background of the study. When the researcher wants to focus on a particular aspect of a theme, on a particular perspective of a problem, then that perspective or that specific theme does have a background. Maybe other researchers, other philosophers have also talked about this specific problem, this specific question, or looked at this specific question from a specific perspective with which the present research proposal deals with. So this is what constitutes the background of the study, the theoretical background of the study. After that comes the objective and scope of the study. The researcher is not expected to deal with all the questions or all the issues that arise with respect to the specific problem that the researcher wants to handle. So the researcher has to specify, has to delineate the specific perspective or the specific questions that he or she wants to talk about, discuss in his or her research proposal. So the scope of the study means delineating, specifying the issues, the questions, the perspectives that the researcher wants to discuss. And of course, the researcher has some objective in his or her mind with which he or she wants to take up this research. So this objective also needs to be formulated, needs to be briefly discussed in this part. The researcher should also focus on the implications of his or her research work. The researcher is expected to convince the reader that the particular research work that he or she wants to undertake has some important philosophical implications in the specific area of discourse. The researcher is expected to convince the reader that undertaking the research in this specific area is something philosophically important or valuable. This also serves as the justification of the particular research work that the researcher wants to undertake. The next point that the researcher is expected to focus on is a brief review of literature. There might be many other philosophers who have worked on this problem, who have undertaken study of this specific topic. So the researcher is expected to present some of the seminal works, some of the important views that have been presented in the philosophical literature. So this brief review of literature actually shows that the researcher is well acquainted with the area of her research work. The next point that the researcher is expected to focus on is what is called major research gap. Since there have been other works on this particular problem in this particular area, the researcher must convince the reader that certain things have been ignored, certain points or issues have not been discussed in the relevant literature. So this is what constitutes the major research gap. The researcher is expected to fill up that gap. The researcher is expected to find out that some of the important questions or important issues have remained unattended by the philosophers who have worked in this particular research area. The next point that the researcher is expected to deal with is giving a list of major research questions. What are the major questions that arise or that one could ask in this particular research area? In fact, formulating the major research questions in one's research proposal also helps the researcher to give a proper structure to his or her research. Next comes the point regarding methodology. What kind of methods the researcher is interested to follow in his or her research work. Usually, in philosophy, our methodology consists in conceptual analysis. We acquire data from our experience and then we refine them and then we form a theoretical structure of our analysis of our experiences. So in a significant sense, our experience provides us with the raw data that we philosophize on. But then there could be a statistical part of philosophical research, especially people who work on social, political, philosophical issues. A large part of their research might consist of statistical data available from different sources. Now, there are specific methods of gaining or acquiring statistical data, and the researcher should be aware of those different statistical methods and specify which particular statistical method that he or she has followed, and also he or she should give some justification of that particular statistical method that the researcher has followed. And of course then comes the tentative chapterization. This is tentative because in the course of research, the researcher might reformulate, might reshape many of the chapters. But still, to start with, the researcher should have some basic ideas about the chapters of his or her research, and also the researcher should have some idea about the content of each of these chapters. The research proposal must have a bibliography. Now, this bibliography may not be the final one because the researcher has just started his or her research work, so he or she cannot be expected to be aware of the entire philosophical literature that has been available on that particular theme. But at least to start with, the researcher should add a bibliography. The researcher is expected to read and to go through the books, or the chapters of the books, or the articles published that deal with the problems, deal with the questions, or that are relevant to the present research topic of the researcher. Many of us do their research on classical Indian philosophical texts that are mainly written in Sanskrit or Prakrit or Pali. We should remember that when one is interested in doing research on a classical Indian philosophical text, that research should not exhaust itself in just translating the main ideas of that text. The researcher is expected to throw some new light on that classical text. The researcher is expected to extract the philosophical, conceptual issues that have been dealt with in that classical text. And in that way, the researcher can make the classical text a contemporary one. So the philosophical research on a classical Indian philosophical text should make the text, the ideas embedded in the text, relevant to the modern day philosophical discourse. In that way only, the research on the classical philosophical text could have a substantial philosophical content. The other thing that the researcher should remember while doing his or her research on a classical Indian philosophical text is that classical Indian philosophical text might already have been translated and explained by some other authors. So the researcher must emphasize the uniqueness of his or her approach to the text. Because in that way the researcher can justify that in spite of the availability of other explanations, other translations of the classical text, the present researchers' research on that particular text is something valuable, is something worthwhile. The other point that one should remember is many of us are interested doing research on contemporary Indian philosophers like, say, Gandhi, Vivekananda, Rabindranath, Ambedkar, etc. We should remember that when we, as students of philosophy, are interested in these great figures, we should approach them as a student of philosophy. This is important because many of these great thinkers, they are not only philosophers in a narrow professional sense, they are social reformers, they are, great minds tried to change the human society as a whole. So, their contribution moves much beyond professional philosophy. But we, as students of philosophy, when we approach them, when we read them, when we try to philosophize on their ideas, our approach should be critical, conceptual reconstruction of their key philosophical ideas. There is no point in arguing again and again that how great these people were. As a student of philosophy, what is expected is try to construct, try to conceptualize, try to problematize the ideas that one comes across in the works of these great thinkers. When one wants to undertake a research on classical Indian philosophical texts, one must have knowledge of the language in which these texts were written. For example, one must have first-hand knowledge of Sanskrit or Pali or Prakrit in the case of research on classical Indian philosophical texts. Of course, one could take help of secondary literature, but without exposure to the original texts, the quality of the research work is bound to be hampered, bound to be affected. Two main guiding points that a philosophy researcher should keep in his or her mind is: first, novelty in the research. The reader is expected to ask the researcher, what is your conclusion, or what is your observation, or what is your perspective to this problem that is unique? The researcher should be clear in his or her mind where does his or her uniqueness lie in this particular research. He or she should be able to respond to the question, what do you think, or what is your conclusion, and why do you think that this conclusion is a valid one? And the second point that the researcher should keep in his or her mind is, as a student of philosophy, the main focus is on the philosophical arguments and counter arguments. So, formulating, presenting the philosophical arguments, presenting the counter arguments, and then also trying to respond to those counter arguments. These actually constitute a philosophical research work. So instead of focusing on peripheral issues like the biography of a great philosopher or what other philosophers think of this particular individual philosopher, one should focus on what kind of philosophical ideas that one could extract and what kind of philosophical counter arguments that one could come up with, not only for the sake of critical assessment, but also for the sake of clarification of different philosophical ideas. Thank you very much.